The title of today's podcast is How to Stop Losing Money to the IRS. And today I'm going to be speaking specifically to pastors here in the United States. So sorry those of you who are not living here, but this does involve our Internal Revenue Service. You're going to learn some things today that will help you in your ministry and obviously touch your bottom line. You may think that you know certain things, but it's likely that you don't. So stay tuned. Back in a moment.
Welcome to Minister's Toolbox, providing leaders with the tools they need to succeed in ministry. Now, here's your host, Casey Sabella.
During episode 163, I was stunned to learn that our downloads had increased by 400%. It appears that pastors are very much interested in how to invest their money and money in general, and that I get that. In fact, money is one of the top 3 reasons that pastors leave the ministry: lack of money or lack of resource. So I understand that. So today I want to talk to you about how to stop giving extra money to the Internal Revenue Service. And again, just to share with you, like I did in episode 163 about how to invest wisely, I spent some years as an investment advisor, and I was licensed in Series 6, Series 7. I was able to sell stocks and do estate planning and all that kind of stuff. I no longer have that designation because you have to keep that very current, so I can no longer put myself out as that, and neither I also don't want to put myself out as that. So I'm not qualified to give investment advice, and I made that very clear during that episode. Also, I am not qualified to give tax advice, so you're listening to someone who's not qualified to give advice in these areas. However, I may have some things that I can share with you as someone who has been through life experience. I did not become an investment advisor because I chose to. I became an investment advisor because things happened. I think that you can relate to that if you've been in the ministry for any amount of time. Things happen. At the time in my life, I was in my mid-30s, and I was pastoring a mid-sized church. We had double services, and we were packed out every week. I had hired staff. We had all kinds of things going. We were really a church on the move and on our way to really becoming a big deal. God was moving in some great ways, but I can tell you also that Satan was moving in some ways too, and I think you can relate to that as a pastor. In any case, not because of financial mismanagement, not because of sexual sin, but because of things that it would take too long to describe, I found that in a series of brief weeks, I lost that church entirely, and I lost my income. I mean, overnight, I went from being a full-time pastor to being someone who needed a job. And if you know anything about that kind of industry, as far as the church here in the United States, you don't necessarily get unemployment or any of those kind of benefits if you are no longer in the ministry. Long story, and again, I don't want to get into all those details, but I was forced to go into a field that I had no knowledge of. And I started in the insurance field, and that led to me into the investment field, so on and so forth. That's how I got there. In any case, a number of years ago, as I felt the leading of the Lord, and as I began to respond to the Lord, I felt him calling me back to full-time ministry. So I left the investment field, my goodness, at least more than 15 or more years ago, and just got out of that field altogether. It's not that I didn't like it. I enjoyed helping people with their investments. I didn't so much enjoy all the technical details of investing, but I did enjoy helping people to secure their financial goals. It was very, very, very pastoral in that regard. I really felt like I was helping people achieve their goals. But in any case, I am no longer in that field, obviously, and I'm now a pastor. Now, I'm sharing all that as a background to give you a sense that I kind of see myself as the crash dummy of ministry. I've been in ministry for 4 decades. Most of that is in full-time ministry. I have seen just about everything you can see and done just about everything you can do, both positively and negatively. I know what makes ministers tick because I've been through the challenges. I've been betrayed. I've had people stab me in the back, in the front, on the side, in the head, just about every other direction. I know what it is to go through the daily challenges of ministry. Within that context, I'm sharing these things with you today. And again, I'm not a tax expert, but I've learned some things that I think can be really of some benefit to you. How are you losing money to the IRS? By not knowing the benefits that are afforded you through the IRS. In the United States, we have a tremendous benefit. It's called the Housing Allowance. Now, let me just stop right there. If you know about the Housing Allowance, that's not the secret I want to share with you today. A lot of pastors knowing about the Housing Allowance still do not use it properly, so stay tuned. But if you don't know anything about the Housing Allowance, here's how it works. You are allowed under the Internal Revenue Service as a minister of the gospel to segregate a certain portion of your income for housing. As a simple example, and I'll just use some figures here. Don't be insulted if these figures are too high or too low. I'm just using these figures just to make it clear. Let's just say that your entire designation or your entire income, your entire pay as a pastor is $50,000 a year. That may be good, bad, or indifferent depending on where you live. $50,000 is your income. Now, your board can designate that $20,000 of that $50,000 can be allocated for housing allowance. Now, why would they do that, and what's the benefit? Well, if you designate $20,000 of that, you can use that $20,000 for your housing allowance, and that means that at the end of the year, you will not have income tax liability on that $20,000. You'll still have income tax liability on the other 30, but you will not have income tax liability on that 20, and that can save you a lot of money. Also keep in mind, you are never exempt from FICA, F.I.C.A., and FICA must be paid on the entire $50,000, period. So the Social Security is not affected by this. But as far as your income tax on that amount, that reduces your income tax liability and can be a great benefit if done properly. And there's the rub. A lot of pastors don't do this properly. You can't simply, let's just give you an example. You can't simply at the end of the year just deduct all your housing expenses and take that off your taxes. That's not legal. Your board has to actually officially designate the amount in an official board meeting at a specific time that says, okay, this amount is going to be used for housing during this particular year. It has to show up legally. It has to show up at a meeting of the board in order to make that happen. If it doesn't, then you can't simply deduct those expenses. The IRS will not recognize that. But let's just say that your board has designated $20,000 out of that 50 is going to go to housing allowance. That means you can deduct expenses on your housing, like your mortgage and utilities. Most pastors who understand housing allowance pretty much know that. So you can you can take the amount that you pay for your mortgage or rent and your expenses with regards to utilities like water and power, electricity, that sort of thing. Those can all fit into that amount of money for housing allowance, and that can be something you are not taxed on at the end of the year. Here's the dynamic. Here's the challenge, however. You need to get that number correct. For example, let's say you designate $20,000 for a housing allowance, but at the end of the year you've spent $25,000 for housing. Guess what? You can only deduct $20,000. That's what's designated for housing allowance. Let's look at the opposite extreme. Let's suppose that you have a $20,000 housing allowance, but you only spend $15,000 on housing. Here's the tricky part. If you have only spent $15,000, you're on the hook for the $5,000 you did not spend for housing. And you may have additional fines attached to that. You got to be careful. Get that number as close as you possibly can for the maximum benefit. So it has to be designated by the board. It has to be something you get as close as you possibly can. But here's the thing, and here's the secret that I want to share with you as a fellow minister. A lot of pastors, and this included me for the longest time, never realized what can be designated, what can be put under that aspect of housing allowance. Again, most of us realize that utilities and water or sewer or septic, those kind of things can be included in your housing allowance. But did you know your wife goes out and buys a broom, housing allowance? A broom. Cleaning supplies, housing allowance. Paper towels, housing allowance. Toilet paper, nope, doesn't clean the house. Let's not get into that. Whatever is involved in cleaning the house is a housing expense that can be put in the housing allowance. Whatever is used to repair the house, housing allowance. Can of paint, housing allowance. Do you purchase furniture? Housing allowance. Drapes or curtains, housing allowance. Anything that's used, decorations for the house at Christmas, housing allowance. Anything that's done to repair your house or replace anything. You fix a toilet, whatever you get at Lowe's or Home Depot, housing allowance. I can't think of a time that I've gone to Home Depot or Lowe's or whatever you have in your area that's used for building supplies. I can't remember a time I've ever gone to one where whatever I've bought has not been a housing expense. If there's a board, if there's anything you're going to stick a nail into that's going to do any kind of repair or improvement to your house, it all comes under housing allowance. So if you replace a floor, if you put in a rug, if you do anything that improves your house, and I mean anything, that can come under the housing allowance. Did you buy a lawnmower? Housing allowance. Did you buy gasoline for that lawnmower? Housing allowance. All of that is part of the maintaining of your house. Repairing your car? Not housing allowance. Has nothing to do with your house. You can't deduct that. Sorry. I wish you could. Car insurance? Not housing allowance. But insurance on your house? Housing allowance. I think you're kind of getting the feel. A lot of the things that we do on a regular basis are for our housing. And if you don't itemize those issues, you're losing a lot to the IRS unnecessarily. Now, here's the thing. They're not going to knock on your door and say, Mr. and Mrs., you're not getting this benefit because you didn't designate. They're not going to tell you anything. If you want to pay more taxes to them, they'll say, thank you very much. If you try to rip them off, well, they'll show up at your door and expect you to pay. The IRS is really good about finding people that are trying to abuse the system, but they're not going to tell you the benefits you can get. That's something that you've got to investigate yourself. Once again, I'm not a tax expert. I'm not somebody who can advise in that. I will have some resources in the show notes page today that you can look at that'll help you in that regard. But I'm not a tax expert. Don't pretend to be. I'm just giving you advice as a fellow minister. But begin to get your brain acclimated to thinking in relationship to how can I, by doing my ministry, what are the things that I'm purchasing? What are the things I'm about to purchase? What do you think I'm going to purchase in the next year? To try to put together a number that will get you as close as possible to the maximum that you can take for housing allowance. Now, let me advise you in this way also. Don't be abusive. There is a law firm, and I failed to remember their name, and thankfully I don't remember their name, but a number of years ago, and unfortunately they continue to operate. I get mail from them all the time. It's really dreadful. But they supposedly advocate for pastors, and they have seminars. I unfortunately went to one of their seminars, and I mean, I felt like I needed to take a shower at the end of the seminar. It was just gross. Essentially, what they were doing is encouraging pastors to live the most lavish lifestyles they possibly could and try to rip off, basically, they didn't say rip off, but they were, trying to rip off the IRS for every dollar they possibly could. Don't be that minister. Don't try to use your ministry as an advantage to take advantage of the IRS or anybody else. Those kind of things never end well. However, at the same time, there are benefits that the IRS has afforded to you that you should take advantage of. Anything, and I mean any expense used for housing, you can deduct. Groceries, nope, that's not for housing expenses, you see. But there's part of groceries, like I said before, paper towels, housing allowance, cleaning supplies, anything that is involved in cleaning your house is a housing expense. Anything that is involved in repairing your house, whatever it is, even if you have to purchase a tool to make a repair, housing expense. Keep accurate records of these things. About 1 or 2 feet from where I'm broadcasting right now is a folder, and in the folder are receipts. And anytime my wife or I go out and purchase anything, if we purchase anything online, if we purchase anything at a store, we look at it and say, is this something that goes into the housing allowance category? If it does, it goes into the folder for that month. At the end of the month, I staple all those receipts together. That coincides with my bank statement, And that bank statement is basically put together so that at the end of the year, every bank statement shows me all housing expenses that I've made. At the end of the year, I get a really good idea of our housing expenses. Sometimes it takes a few years to really get this right, but it's worth it if you don't have to pay extra taxes to the IRS. Because guess what? If you don't pay extra taxes to the IRS, that also helps your church. Because if you're paying extra taxes to the IRS, your church has to pay those extra funds to you in order for you to pay them to the IRS. So it helps the church and it helps you. I think it's also wise to speak with your leaders about this and discuss this frankly. Even let them listen to this podcast. A lot of people have real misconceptions about pastoral money. And I do talk about this in episode 11, and that would be another good episode for anybody on your board or anybody even in your church to listen to really get a sense of what it's all about. A lot of people have misconceptions about how pastors are paid and how much they should be paid and all the rest of that kind of stuff. But it's really important for them to understand, because most people think that pastors are tax-free. They think that they're completely free of taxes, which is completely false. We are paying taxes like anybody else. But we do have a benefit that no one else has, and that's what I just mentioned, this housing allowance. So I hope that this has been of some benefit to you. I'm hoping that you will take advantage of it, at least this year. We're really heading toward the end of the year. This is a time to sit down with your board and begin to negotiate what your salary is going to be looking like next year, and take into consideration these housing dynamics, because you can save your church money and obviously save yourself a lot of money if you put this together properly. Don't go crazy and overestimating. Like I said earlier, if you overestimate and come like several $1,000s over what you're going to spend, you end up paying taxes on that. So try to get it as close as you can. Even if it's just a hair under, that's the wise place to be. But you're going to be amazed at the kind of expenses on a regular basis that you're putting out from just your groceries that you're spending on housing that you didn't realize you were doing. So I hope this has been of a real benefit to you. Before we end, you know that I always end each podcast, each video, with a quote, and this one is especially for you. It comes from Will Rogers. Who else? And he said this: "The difference between death and taxes, death doesn't get worse every time Congress meets." Boy, he got that right. Have a great day.
For more resources, go to ministerstoolbox.com. Thanks for listening.